Have you guys ever wondered about sovereignty versus free will? God's sovereignty specifically, and our free will. Sometimes people get confused on this. They misunderstand what sovereignty is and how God uses it. And first, let's think about that. Sometimes people picture this sovereign God as a tyrant, that he does whatever he wants, um, to do whatever, to make us do whatever he wants us to do. Right? This is not God. This is not our God. This is not his character. We can read through the Bible, and very quickly, in pretty much every story, we will see God is not a tyrant. He is sovereign. Yes, he has authority above everything. He has the highest authority, a supreme authority over the entire universe, over the world, over us. He does have authority over us, but he doesn't wield it to force us to do whatever he wants. It's my way or the highway. I either do this or you're going to die, right? God could do that. He has the authority to do that, but he is he cares about us. He is benevolent. He loves us, and he wants us to do his will, because he knows his will is best. And if we want to look in the Bible, let's start looking through some stories where we see God's sovereignty and coming in contact with our free will. Start from the very beginning, Adam and Eve, right? God created Adam and Eve, perfect creations, to be in communion with him, to walk with him in the garden, to have a relationship with him and with each other and with the world that he created. Um, and but he gave him free will, because this is the important thing when we start talking about free will, is without free will there is no ability to give love freely. If you take away free will, then we're not choosing to love him. We are choosing. We have no choice at all in the matter. In fact, it's we do it, or or there's nothing. There's no or. Even the angels, he gave a degree of free will, and that was different than our degree of free will. It was much less. But yet, even the angels, a third of them rebelled. Again, this was not God's sovereign will. This was not his. This wasn't his desire. Did he have authority? Could he have stopped it? Yes, he could. I mean, he did stop it, but he could have prevented it from happening. He could have taken away even the bit of free will that he gave to the angels and not ever given it to them, and just had them as robots that would always serve him and worship him and do nothing else. He could have done that, but that's not how he wanted them even to worship him. But then he created humans, who had much more free will than the angels did. And he gave them access to the tree of knowledge of good and evil and told them not to eat from it. Right? You can eat from all the other trees. He made beautiful trees all over the garden. Beautiful food, wonderful food to eat. But in order to give them free will, he had to give them a choice. And so he gave them a choice. Okay, you can eat from all this other stuff, all these other things, but don't eat from that one. Don't eat from that one. Of course, we know that Adam and Eve chose their free will. They were tempted by the one who first chose his free will, Lucifer, right? They chose they chose to rebel against God. And so again, here's the free will versus the sovereignty. We can go a little farther. We can go into Saul. God put Saul as the king over Israel. It wasn't his desire. The Israelites really wanted a king. He gave in to their desires, and gave them a king. Saul ended up rebelling and doing what he wanted to do, because he was afraid of the people. He was more worried about the people than he was about God. David, we see the opposite happening with him. He had the chance to rebel against God. He had the chance to He could have killed Saul when Saul was hunting him, trying to kill him. This is King David and King Saul. And instead, he trusted God, that God would take care of him. And it was a lot longer path. But he did trust God. And with his free will, he chose to follow God. And he became who God said was a man after God's own heart. So this is an amazing thing, right? But he had free will to do that. Other kings did not do that. They did not choose that path. But it was a path full of pain to get there, to get to that point, to be that person who could do that. We could jump forwards to, let's jump forwards all the way to the other Saul that we know from the New Testament. Saul, he had free will, right? God had a sovereign plan for his life that was very clear, that we see later on. But Saul had free will, and Saul was using his free will to fight God. He thought he was doing God a favor by fighting the Christians. But and then he thoroughly enjoyed and cast approval of the stoning of Stephen, and wanted to keep doing it. I think here that God was trying to get a hold of Saul at this point. Saul was going down a path that was very destructive, and it was against God, though he thought he was doing it for God. But Saul, God was trying to get a hold of Saul, and Stephen gave a wonderful, very descriptive picture from the beginning to the end of where they were at to Jesus coming, of God's plan of redemption and love and his work. And this is something that Saul would have appreciated up until the point where it started talking about Jesus. This is something that God was trying to get a hold of him. He was trying to show him, and he did show him, his path of redemption through this whole history. But Saul still chose in his free will to say, no, I don't want to hear. I'm not going to listen. And at that point, and he chose to have blind eyes, right? To cover his ears, to have blind eyes, to kill Stephen instead of listen. And but God wasn't done. God in his sovereignty, God in his perfect, persistent plan, because God had Saul was the one who he wanted to spread the gospel to the Gentiles, to be the lead missionary person on that. And God then, when Saul was on his way to Tarsus, right, he sent the blinding light, and he talked to him. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? To which, Saul replied, who are you, Lord? He knew that he should address him as Lord, meaning master, meaning, this someone is talking to me out of the sky, and has to be someone supreme. But he did not recognize him as Jesus. And then he said, I am Jesus. I'm the one who you're persecuting. And this is the point where now the truth came, bam, not just through the spoken, this is where it all clicked, right? Stephen had given this message and had shown this was truly God's redemption plan. This is who Jesus was. This is who Jesus is. And now Saul comes, blindingly in contact with this truth, and can no longer deny it. And he still has a choice, though. He still had a choice what to do, and we see many times through his through Acts where he still had the choice. And so we see that his physical eyes were matching what his spiritual eyes were. And he goes to Damascus, right? And Ananias prays for him, and then something like scales fall from his eyes. And now he can see the truth of who Jesus is. But an interesting point here is that it's likely that his eyes were never as good as they used to be at this point. We see later on his physical eyes. We see later on that he talks about a thorn in his flesh that he asked God to remove. And then he gives a reference that I can testify that if you could have, he's talking to the Philippians, I believe. I can testify that if you could have plucked out your eyes and given them to me, you would have. So he likely had an issue with his eyes. He also talks about that he didn't write a lot of the stuff, but he wrote some of the stuff with his own hand, and he likely had an issue with his eyes at that point, because he had to go through this, and he now had a reminder that this is who God is, and this is how God got a hold of him, and he had to rely on God through this, and that God's grace was sufficient for Saul in his weakness, and then we see Saul's transformation, not just with this physical encounter, but we see that he became someone different. And common misconception is God didn't rename him to Paul, right? There's other situations, in the Bible where God renamed someone. Okay, you're Simon, now you'll be called Peter, right? But this wasn't one of those. Saul means like giant man, and that stopped being his identity. He stopped seeing himself as a giant among men. He had, and we can read about how much he had reason to, and who he was educated under, and his status. He was well known, and he was revered, and he could have lorded that over people. He was also a Roman citizen, which also gave him a ton of rights. He did not use those rights. He did not use those things. Instead, he says, whatever was to my, let's see, let me get the verse started. All those things he now considered rubbish. And rubbish is a bad translation for it. It's a watered down translation, because the actual term there, this is the degree of how much Paul had changed. It actually means menstrual cloths. It was so, or no, was that the menstrual cloths one, or is that the dung? No, this is the dung one. There's another part, the menstrual cloths one. Anyway, sorry, this is the dung one. It's poop, feces, right? This is that's what he considered it. He considered his past life and all the things that were to his benefit, all the things that were to his credit. And he changes his name to no longer be great man, but to the Greek name. So that was his Hebrew name, to the Greek name, Paul, which means small man. That was his identity. His identity had changed. That was his choice. That was part of his free will, that he chose to change in his identity. This wasn't something that God forced him to do. Yes, God came in encounter with him, and he had an amazing encounter that he could not deny with the truth and who Jesus is. But he chose to become the small man, not to be the giant man anymore. Yes, after that is when he became a giant in our faith, and he wrote, a good portion of the New Testament. And He spread the good news throughout the known world, the news of Jesus. But he did it as a small man, not as a giant man. And he did it by the strength of God. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. That's what how he did it. And so I want you all to be challenged. God is sovereign. He has a sovereign plan. But sometimes we have to go through things because our will is not ready to submit to his. And it's not a matter of, I want to do one more story from the Bible here, because when we look at Paul's life, we think, oh, well, of course he now submitted to God. He had this amazing encounter. There are so many times in the Old Testament that we can see examples of where people had an amazing encounter and still did not submit to his will. Jonah, great example right away. He had an encounter with God. He heard God's voice. God saved him in the belly of the whale, and he still didn't change his attitude towards God. Yes, he ended up doing God's will to a degree. He was God's prophet, but he still, his heart was not changed. We see the Israelites, right? The children of Israel, when they were coming out of Egypt, they had just seen God's amazing, miraculous wonders with the plagues, and then we see them, the pillar of cloud by night, the pillar of fire by day, the pillar of cloud by night. We see the God parting the Red Sea and killing all of the Egyptians, the Egyptian soldiers in the Red Sea. And after this, after seeing all of that amazing stuff, even water coming from a rock and being fed miraculously, manna from heaven, we see the Israelites still not obeying God, still wanting to go back into their old ways, still not walking away, wanting to walk away from Egypt and not wanting to follow God. They still had free will, and that free will they chose to use to rebel against God. Thankfully, the next generation did the opposite. They used their free will to follow God, and led by Joshua. And they did follow God, and they did see his wonders still again. But they did so following God with their free will. So we all have free will. God has a sovereign plan. God has plans that he wants to do in us and through us, every one of us. He knit us in our mother's womb, and we are fearfully and wonderfully made. He has a plan for us, an abundant plan, full of abundant life. Does that mean prosperity? Not necessarily. It could, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. Does it mean everything will be easy? Probably not. We don't see that when people are following God's will in the Bible. We don't see a lot of everything going perfect for them. Look at the prophets. Look at Saul. Look at Peter. We can see lots of examples where that wasn't the case. So we're not looking for a perfect, good, easy, prosperous life when we're following God's will. God has a sovereign will, a sovereign plan for your life. Does that mean he wants to treat you like a robot? No. Does that mean he wants to treat you like a slave? No. It means he wants to treat you like a son. All right, a son. And yes, ladies, you're included in this. Not in a bad way, in a good way. Sonship is the sons are heirs, and ladies, you guys are heirs as well, according to the promise. You're heirs in Christ, with Christ, with us. We are all sons when we are adopted into God's household. Yes, he knows you're his daughter, but as far as the legal right and term in the Bible, it's sonship. And so, but he also, he says there's not male or female, slave or free. he talks about this. So anyway, sorry, a little bit of rabbit trail, but we are, he has a plan for us as children of God. He wants us to treat us as his children, to teach us how to live. And he knows what we need, and he knows what we should not have. And we need to make sure we submit to that will. We submit to his ways. We submit to him and embrace him in that will. Not that he's going to force it upon us. Not that he has exactly one perfect path in your life that you only can go. And if you veer from that path anywhere, you're not in his perfect plan. Yes, he is sovereign. No, he is not like that. He is not a dictator, that you have to do exactly what he says at exactly the right time. You see, this is like Saul, right? Was it God's will that Saul persecute the church? No. Did God use that to have an encounter with him and bring him to know Jesus? Yes, he did. For we know that God can use all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. He uses those things to draw us to him, to make us more like him, to prepare us to be the people he wants us to be. Everything, all things. But they're not, all things are not going to be easy and they're not going to be perfect, those things. Those things were not part of God's will that God used in his perfect sovereignty in order to bring Paul into God's will. Does that make sense? There are so many things in our lives. They're not taking away from God's sovereignty. They're not taking away from God's will for our lives. God uses them in our lives to do the things that we need at that time to prepare us to be the people he needs us to be, to do the things he wants us to do. So things that you may have done in the past, things that you may have gone through in the past, challenges you may have gone through, bad choices you may have gone through and done, places you may have walked that you shouldn't have walked, they are now able to be used completely for God's sovereign purpose and will in your life today. Do not think about those as regrets and as things where, I wish I could have done this, then things would be different. We don't see Paul saying, I wish I had believed and not killed Stephen and not had to go through this blinding encounter and have my eyes get damaged. We don't see that. Paul knew that those things had happened, and he knew that God was using them for his perfect will in his life, and he had changed him and molded him and made him become the man that God wanted Paul to be, and that God wanted Saul to be as he became Paul, this small man. And so let God reframe the things in your life, that it wasn't out of God's sovereignty that he made you do them or that he put you through them. See, this is another pitfall that people get in. Oh, well, God wanted that to happen in order to have this happen in my life. No. That's not how it works. God used that in order to have this in your life because you needed it. Maybe because other people needed it. God uses those things. He does not make those things happen. Okay? I have made bad choices in my life. I have made bad financial choices. I've made bad spiritual choices. I've made bad relational choices in my life. I've made bad business choices in my life. Did God make me do those? No. Did God take those? And now is he using them for good in my life to do his will Yes, definitely. He is. And he used those things to prepare me to become the man that I am today so that I can do his will today and continue to become the man that he wants me to be for tomorrow and the next day and the next year. Even if I make choices that are not the right ones, he will use those then to prepare me to be the person that he wants me to be going forwards. This is how sovereignty works. God's sovereignty works. He's not surprised when we make bad choices. It doesn't throw him off. Oh man, Jonah did not want to go to Nineveh. I don't know what I'm going to do. Who else am I going to send? Is that what God did? No, he sent a storm. He ended up sending him down into the water to be swallowed by a fish and spit out and go to Nineveh anyway. It could have been so much easier for Jonah if he had just obeyed. But he wasn't the person that he needed to be. It wasn't willing to be that person at that point. And God chose a path to get him there. And God's will for the Israelites was for them to go straight to the promised land for, there was a time for a year, but then they were supposed to go into the promised land instead of having to wait, 39 more years to be able to go in and have all those people die off and have the new generation go in. His plan was for all of them to go in. But them not choosing that in their free will did not throw off God's sovereign plan. He was able to handle it just fine. And his sovereign will was still accomplished by them going in and the promise to Abraham fulfilled. He was still able to do that. And so, when we look at the Israelites and their journey through the process, we think about it as one person, it helps us to be able to relate to them more than being many people. If we think about it as one person and their choices that they made, and part of them had to die before they were ready to go into the promised land, before they were ready to do his will, his perfect sovereign will. And we may have to let part of us die. The part of us that has a will that is counter to what God wants, that is counter to his ways. We may need to have part of us die. And let's be willing to let that part of us die. Let's not fight it. It's much more painful to fight it than to let it die willingly. And then we can be ready to move forwards with who God wants us to be today, so that we can do the works that he wants to do through us and in us. And we can see his sovereign will fulfilled in our lives. Remember, sovereign will doesn't equal a forced will, doesn't equal something that he's going to make us do. His sovereign will is, just a second, I got it. Hopefully that wasn't vibrating in the recording. Got a call coming through. His sovereign will is what he wants, and he has the authority to do, but he wants to partner with us and do it with us. He could have gone to the Ninevites and in a blinding flash of light told them, you need to listen to me, you guys are screwed up. He could have done that, but that's not how he wanted to act. That's not what he wanted to do. He wanted to send Jonah to go preach to them, to go tell them, hey, you guys are going to be destroyed by God. And then they repented. So let's let God do his work in our lives. Let's embrace his work. Let's embrace where we are today, and that God used everything that has happened yesterday, the day before, last year, the 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whether it was our choices, whether it was things that were done to us, whether it was things that were done around us, whether it was influences that we were around. God can take all of those things, and has taken all of those things, and is using those to transform you into the person that God wants and needs you to be today, to do his work today. And let's partner with him and allow God to do his work in us and through us today. The sovereign plan that he has for us in his will. All right, guys, let's do it.